A cold, dark night on an alien planet. The cold wind howled through the dark alien forest. The twin moons hung low in the sky, casting a dim, silvery glow over the rough terrain. Relia stumbled forward, her breathing shallow, her legs weak. Her body ached from the wounds she had suffered earlier. Every step felt heavier, but she could not stop. She was alone now. Her people had left her behind. They had called her weak. A burden, not worth saving. The thought burned in her mind like fire, but she had no energy to feel anger. The freezing night air bit into her skin, and her vision blurred. The thick trees around her seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching for her like hungry claws. Then a sound. A low growl rumbled through the darkness. She wasn't alone. Her heart pounded. Slowly, she turned her head. Red eyes glowed between the trees. One pair, then two, then five. Night stalkers. The deadly creatures moved closer, their long, sharp teeth flashing in the dim light. Their bodies were covered in thick, dark fur, blending with the shadows. Their claws scraped against the rocky ground as they surrounded her. Relia had no weapon, no strength, no hope. She took a step back. A sharp pain shot through her ankle, and she collapsed onto the cold ground. This was it. This was how she would die. A final broken breath left her lips as she closed her eyes. Then, a blinding light. A loud boom echoed through the forest. The ground shook. The creatures hissed and backed away. Relia forced her eyes open. A bright beam of light cut through the darkness. A strange, powerful sound followed, the hum of human technology. Then a tall figure stepped into view, a human. He was clad in dark, armored gear. A heavy rifle rested in his hands, glowing faintly with energy. His stance was strong, unshaken, as if he had faced monsters like these before. The night stalkers hesitated. The human took one step forward. Then he spoke. "Get away from her." His voice was calm, steady, dangerous. The creatures snarled, their bodies tense. Then he fired. A sharp blue streak of energy shot from his rifle, striking the ground near the pack. The explosion sent dirt and smoke flying. The creatures howled and scattered into the shadows. Silence. Relia's body trembled. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs refused to move. Her vision swam, and darkness tugged at the edges of her mind. She fought to stay awake. The human moved closer, his heavy boots crunching against the ground. He knelt beside her, his face hidden behind a reflective visor. She could barely see his features, but his posture was not threatening. She flinched as he reached for her, but his voice was gentler this time. "You're safe now." Relia wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him she didn't need a human's help, but her body had already made the decision for her. The cold, the exhaustion, the pain, it was too much. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the human reaching for his communicator. "I found someone. She's injured. I'm bringing her back." Then, nothing. Trusting the human. The first thing Relia felt was warmth. It wrapped around her like a blanket, unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. The last thing she remembered was cold, freezing air, hunger, pain, and the human. Her eyes fluttered open, and she found herself inside a strange place. Metal walls, dim lighting. A faint hum filled the air, like the quiet whisper of machines running in the background. Her body ached, but it was no longer unbearable. A soft, synthetic fabric covered her, a human survival blanket. Then she noticed the man. He sat a few feet away, adjusting a device on his wrist. His helmet was off now, placed beside him on the floor. His dark hair was slightly messy, and his sharp eyes flicked toward her the moment she moved. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then the human leaned forward. "You're awake." Relia flinched. Her body tensed as she tried to sit up, her instincts screaming at her to be on guard. He raised his hand slightly. "Easy. You're still weak." She ignored his warning and pushed herself up, only to feel a sharp ache in her ribs. A groan escaped her lips. "Told you," the human muttered, shaking his head. Relia's breath came in short gasps as she steadied herself against the wall. She clenched her fists, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Where am I?" The human leaned back against a metal crate. "My base." She scanned the small room. The walls were reinforced with thick metal plating, and strange human devices sat on shelves. A single console blinked with soft blue lights. Her gaze snapped back to the human. "Why did you bring me here?" He studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then he shrugged. "You were dying." She frowned. "That's not an answer." The human let out a sigh. "Look, I don't know who you are, and I don't know what you did to get left out there. But I wasn't about to let you become monster food." Relia's jaw tightened. "He thinks I did something wrong." She wanted to snap at him, to tell him that her people had betrayed her, that she wasn't abandoned because of a crime or a mistake, but because she wasn't strong enough. But she said nothing. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she turned her gaze toward a nearby table. Her belongings were there: her tattered cloak, her broken communicator, and her knife. She stiffened. Where was her knife? As if reading her thoughts, the human lifted a small blade, turning it between his fingers. "You were clutching this when I found you. Looked like you were ready to fight to the last breath." Relia's muscles tensed. "It's mine." The human tilted his head slightly before flipping the knife and holding it out to her. "Take it." Then she hesitated. Why would a human return a weapon to a stranger? Carefully, she reached out and snatched the blade from his grip, holding it close. The weight of it in her hand was reassuring. The human didn't react. He simply leaned back again. "I'm Captain Daniel Carter, by the way." She narrowed her eyes. "I don't care." He smirked. "Figured." Silence filled the room. Relia's mind raced. She couldn't stay here. She needed to leave. But where would she go? Her people had left her for dead. Even if she tried to find them, they would reject her. Her chest tightened. She had nowhere. Daniel stood up, stretching. "You should rest. Your body's still healing." Relia scoffed. "I don't need your help, human." He raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because when I found you, you were seconds away from being eaten." Her fists clenched. "I could have survived." Daniel let out a short laugh. "Sure you could have." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "But hey, if you really want to leave, go ahead. The door's right there." He gestured toward a heavy metal door, its surface scratched and worn. Relia's gaze flicked toward it. Was he serious? She pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the pain. She took slow, deliberate steps toward the exit, gripping her knife tightly. Daniel didn't stop her. He simply crossed his arms, watching. She reached the door and pressed the panel beside it. Nothing happened. Her brows furrowed. She pressed it again. The door didn't move. Daniel smirked. "Yeah. See, I had to lock it." The creatures outside. They like to hunt at night, and since I didn't feel like having my base torn apart, I figured it was best to keep them out. But hey, if you really want to go, I can open it. He moved toward the console, fingers hovering over a switch. Relia froze. She wasn't afraid of the Night Stalkers. She had faced them before. But injured, weak, and alone. If she stepped outside now, she wouldn't last an hour. Daniel's smirk faded as he watched the realization dawn on her. His voice softened. "You're not my prisoner. You're just stuck here for now." Relia let out a slow breath. She hated this. She hated feeling helpless. She hated that a human had saved her. But she wasn't a fool. She turned away from the door and sat back down, her grip tightening on her knife. Daniel nodded. "Smart choice." She glared at him. "I don't trust you, human." His lips curled into a small grin. "That makes two of us, alien." Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, a night stalker's shriek pierced the air. For now, Relia had no choice but to stay. But she would not let her guard down. The attack. The air inside the human base was stale, thick with the scent of metal and machinery. Relia sat in the dimly lit corner of the small room, gripping the handle of her knife. She could hear Daniel Carter moving around the base, checking equipment, adjusting his weapons. It had been 3 days since he had saved her. She still didn't trust him. But she was trapped here, and she knew that stepping outside alone was suicide. The night stalkers were out there. And worse, she had seen signs that her own people might be nearby. Her clan, the ones who abandoned her. She clenched her jaw. If they found out she was alive, what would they do? Finish the job. Her thoughts were interrupted when Daniel's voice cut through the silence. "You're wasting your energy glaring at the wall." She looked up to see him standing near a console, arms crossed. His rifle rested beside him, within easy reach. "And you're wasting yours talking to me, human." Daniel smirked. Fair enough. He turned back to his console, pressing a few buttons. A low humming sound filled the air. Relia narrowed her eyes. "What are you doing?" He didn't look up. "Scanning for signals." "Signals," she repeated, standing slowly. "Yeah, a distress beacon, a transmission. Anything that can tell me if there are other survivors nearby." Relia stiffened. If a signal was strong enough, her clan's ships might pick it up too. Daniel suddenly frowned. His eyes locked onto the screen. "That's strange." Her stomach twisted. "What?" He didn't answer immediately. His fingers danced over the control panel, adjusting something. A small, flashing red dot appeared on the screen. "There's movement outside the perimeter," he finally said. Relia's grip on her knife tightened. "Night stalkers?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, these aren't creatures." His voice dropped. "They're people." Relia's pulse quickened. "My people," she whispered. Daniel turned to her. "You sure?" She swallowed hard. She knew the way her people moved. Their patrol patterns, their signals. And this was exactly how a hunting party would approach an enemy outpost. But why were they here? Had they come to finish her off, or was it Daniel they were after? Daniel grabbed his rifle. "If they're your people, maybe they're here to help." Relia laughed bitterly. "They don't help the weak." A flicker of emotion crossed Daniel's face, something unreadable. He didn't press further. Instead, he moved quickly, activating a series of defensive measures. Small turrets on the base's exterior whirred to life. The screens showed blurry figures moving through the shadows outside. Daniel muttered under his breath, "They're surrounding us." Relia's heart pounded. Then, a loud bang. The entire base shook. "They're attacking," Daniel shouted, grabbing his rifle. Relia flinched as another explosion rattled the walls. Sparks flew from the overhead lights. "They're trying to breach the doors." Daniel barked, already moving toward the main entrance. Relia followed, instincts kicking in. Her clan was not here for peace. They were here to wipe this place out. She had to make a choice. The fight begins. A sudden hissing noise filled the room. Gas. Relia's eyes widened. "They're flooding the base." Daniel cursed, grabbing a mask from the shelf and tossing another to her. She barely had time to secure it before the air turned toxic. Boom. A section of the wall collapsed. Smoke and debris filled the air. Through the haze, Relia saw them. Her own people. They wore dark armor, their faces hidden behind cold, reflective visors. Their weapons glowed with deadly energy. One of them stepped forward, raising his rifle directly at her. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that armor. "Commander Eric's," she whispered. Daniel didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon and fired first. Chaos and betrayal. Energy blasts tore through the air. Relia ducked behind cover, her heart racing. Daniel moved like a soldier, fast, efficient, deadly. He shot with precision, forcing the invaders back, but there were too many. Relia's hands trembled as she gripped her knife. She could run. She could hide. But then she heard Daniel grunt in pain. She turned. A blast had caught him in the shoulder. He staggered, his rifle slipping from his grip. The commander, Eric's, stepped forward, gun raised. Step aside, Relia. This is not your fight. Her mind raced. Eric's had once trained her. He had called her family. And he had left her to die. Now he was going to kill the human who had saved her. Relia's grip tightened around her knife. A choice made. Daniel's breathing was ragged, blood seeping from his wound. He tried to raise his weapon again, but Eric's kicked it aside. The weak do not deserve to live, Eric said coldly. Relia moved before she could think. She lunged. Her knife sank deep into Eric's side. His eyes widened in shock. You. Relia twisted the blade and pulled it free. Eric's collapsed. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. Then, the other soldiers raised their weapons. Daniel grabbed her arm. Run. They raced through the smoke-filled corridors, dodging enemy fire. Relia's heart pounded, her mind reeling. She had just attacked her own people. There was no turning back now. She had chosen her side. Cliffhanger ending. Daniel slammed his fist against a control panel. A side door hissed open. They stumbled out into the cold night. Alarms blared behind them. Where do we go? Relia gasped. Daniel's jaw tightened. We find a ship. We get off this rock. Relia glanced back. Flames rose from the wreckage of the base. Her people were coming. She took a shaky breath, then let them come. She wasn't weak anymore. She would survive. A dangerous escape plan. The cold wind bit at Relia's skin as she and Daniel Carter sprinted through the rocky terrain, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the burning wreckage of Daniel's base crackled and popped, sending thick plumes of smoke into the alien night sky. They had barely escaped. Her own people had tried to kill her. The weight of that realization pressed against her chest, but there was no time to dwell on it. Not now. Daniel limped beside her, his left shoulder slick with blood from the wound he had taken during the attack. He pressed a hand against it, his jaw clenched in pain. But he didn't slow down. Neither could she. In the distance, the low hum of approaching scout ships vibrated in the air. They were being hunted. Daniel grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a jagged rock formation. We need a plan. His voice was low, urgent. Relia took a deep breath, forcing her mind to focus. We need a ship. Daniel gave a dry chuckle. Yeah, got one in your pocket. She ignored the sarcasm. There's an old crash site not far from here. It belonged to the first human expedition to this planet. Daniel's eyes sharpened. A human ship. Relia nodded. It's broken, but if we can find a power core. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That's a big if. A sudden high-pitched whistle cut through the air. Daniel shoved Relia down just as an energy blast sizzled past her head, striking the rock behind them. They had been spotted. Move, Daniel growled, grabbing his rifle. Relia didn't hesitate. They ran. A desperate race against time. The ground beneath them sloped downward, leading into a narrow canyon. Relia pushed herself faster, feeling the heat of another blast singe the air behind her. Daniel returned fire over his shoulder, but they were outnumbered. They're closing in, Relia shouted. Daniel cursed. We need cover. Now. Ahead, twisted metal wreckage jutted from the canyon floor, the remains of an ancient human shuttle. Relia's heart leaped. There. They slid down the rocky incline, ducking beneath the rusted remains of the ship's hull. Daniel collapsed against a wall, breathing hard. His wound was bad. Relia could see the way his muscles trembled, how his skin had turned pale. He wouldn't last long like this. You're hurt, she said. Daniel grunted. Yeah, thanks for the update. Relia ignored him, pulling a small vial from her belt. Drink this. He eyed it suspiciously. What is it? Stimulant. It'll numb the pain, give you strength. Temporary, but better than bleeding to death. He took it without argument, downing the liquid with a grimace. Within seconds, his eyes sharpened, his breathing steadied. "All right," he said. "Now let's see if this wreck still has any fight left in it." The forgotten ship. The crashed shuttle was ancient, a relic from a past war. Its hull was torn open, exposing its hollow interior to the night. But Relia wasn't looking at the outside. She was looking at the core chamber. She knelt beside the old console, brushing dust off the faded human symbols. This was a military-grade ship. If we're lucky, the power core might still be intact. Daniel crouched beside her. And if we're not lucky, then we die on this planet. Fantastic. Relia's fingers danced across the old controls, reactivating the ship's diagnostic systems. A dull blue light flickered on. Her heart leaped. It still got power. But the celebration didn't last, because the screen also showed something else. Warning. Core still in. Daniel cursed. Of course, because nothing can ever be easy. Relia clenched her fists. My people must have taken it. Daniel frowned. Can we steal it back? She swallowed hard. If it's in their main facility, it'll be heavily guarded. Daniel sighed. So, suicide mission. Relia met his gaze. Wouldn't be my first. A slow grin tugged at the corner of his lips. Same here. Breaking into the lion's den. With no other choice, they began planning. The main alien facility was deep in the mountains, protected by energy shields and elite guards. They couldn't just storm in. But Relia knew something they didn't. A hidden entrance. There's an underground tunnel system beneath the facility, she explained. Old, barely used. We can sneak in through there. Daniel's eyes gleamed with something almost like excitement. And then, we find the power core. We take it. We run. And if they catch us, Relia's grip on her knife tightened. They won't. The journey to the facility. The night was silent as they moved. The alien moonlight cast long shadows across the jagged rocks. The wind howled softly, carrying the distant sounds of their pursuers still searching the canyon. They moved like ghosts, careful, quiet, unseen. Daniel kept his rifle ready, scanning the horizon. This better be worth it. It will be, Relia murmured. She hoped she was right. But deep down, a single thought nagged at her. If they failed, this would be the end. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of dying for nothing. Daniel nudged her. We're close. Relia nodded. Ahead, barely visible in the moonlight, was the entrance to the tunnel system. Their only way in. Their only chance. Cliffhanger ending. They approached the tunnel, but just as they reached the entrance, a sharp metallic click echoed in the air. Relia froze. A voice, cold and familiar, spoke from the shadows. You should have stayed dead, Relia. Her stomach dropped. She turned and found herself staring down the barrel of a gun. It was her father. Betrayal and revelation. The metallic click of the weapon was deafening in the silence. Relia's heart pounded. Her body tensed. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned, her breath shallow. Standing in the shadows of the canyon entrance, flanked by two heavily armed soldiers, was Commander Verne, her father. His armor gleamed under the twin moons, the insignia of the clan High Guard displayed proudly on his chest. His sharp, unreadable gaze locked onto hers. She hadn't seen him since the day she was abandoned, since the day he left her to die. And now he was here. His voice was calm, emotionless. You should have accepted your fate. Relia's fingers curled around the hilt of her knife. She felt Daniel shift beside her, his rifle already halfway raised. Her father's soldiers reacted instantly, their weapons clicking into position. Don't. Verne warned. The tension in the air was thick. Relia's voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. You shouldn't be here. Verne's gaze didn't waver. You shouldn't be alive. Her jaw tightened. So what now? You finish what you started. He exhaled, as if disappointed. You don't understand, Relia. You never did. I spared you a worse fate by leaving you behind. Her fingers dug into the hilt of her blade. Spared me. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. With rage. You left me for dead. She spat. You cast me out like I was nothing. Vern's expression remained unreadable. It was the way of the clan. Only the strongest survive. Daniel let out a low, bitter chuckle. Yeah. And look who's still standing. Vern's eyes flicked toward the human. You should not concern yourself with this, human. This is not your fight. Daniel smirked. She made it my fight when you tried to kill her. And right now, you're standing in my way. Vern's soldiers raised their rifles again. Daniel shifted his stance. You really want to do this? Relia's father sighed. No. I want you to come home. Relia. She froze. Her father lowered his weapon. His gaze softened, just slightly. This is your last chance, he said. Return to the clan. Leave the human behind. Daniel stiffened beside her. Relia's breath hitched. A way back. After everything. For years, she had trained to be strong, to be worthy. But the moment she had failed one mission, they had left her, thrown her away like garbage. And now, suddenly, she was being offered a place again. No, this wasn't kindness. This wasn't forgiveness. This was a test. If she betrayed the human, if she proved her loyalty by killing him, she would be accepted back. But she would never be free. Her father would always watch, always doubt. She would always be the one who almost wasn't good enough. Her grip on her knife tightened. Daniel glanced at her, eyes questioning. Relia. She took a breath. And then she threw her knife. The fight breaks out. The blade sliced through the air, striking the nearest soldier right in the shoulder. He screamed, dropping his weapon. Chaos erupted. Daniel fired first, dropping the second soldier with a well-placed shot. Relia lunged for her father, but Vern moved fast. He dodged, twisting her arm back in a painful lock. You choose the weak, he growled. Relia snarled, twisting free. No, I choose who I am. She kicked forward, knocking him back. Daniel grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the tunnel. We need to move. Now. More soldiers were coming. They could hear the distant sound of reinforcements closing in. Vern wiped a trail of blood from his lip. His gaze was cold. If you leave now, you are no longer my daughter. Relia hesitated. Daniel didn't. He grabbed her hand and pulled her into the tunnel. Her father didn't follow, but his words echoed in her head. Inside the facility, the tunnel was dark and silent, leading them deeper underground. Their footsteps echoed against the damp metal walls. Relia's breath was uneven. Her hands trembled. Daniel glanced at her. You okay? She forced a nod. We need to keep moving. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. No questions, no pity, just trust. The facility's entrance loomed ahead, dimly lit with flashing red warning lights. The power core was inside. One last mission. One last shot at survival. Daniel exhaled. Let's finish this. They stepped forward, into the belly of the beast. One last stand. The facility was a monument to power. Tall steel walls reinforced with energy shielding, massive structures glowing with the pulse of advanced alien technology. The air hummed with power, a constant low vibration that made Relia's skin prickle. She and Daniel Carter crouched in the shadows of a maintenance corridor, scanning the towering complex ahead. The power core was inside, their only way off this planet. But so was an army. Her people, the ones who had abandoned her, the ones she had just betrayed. Daniel adjusted his grip on his rifle. Tell me you've got a plan, 'cause I'm not seeing a way in that doesn't end with us dead. Relia clenched her jaw. She had trained in this facility. She knew its weaknesses. "There's a ventilation access 2 levels below," she whispered. "It leads to the reactor chamber." Daniel exhaled. "Great. Love sneaking through vents. Nothing ever goes wrong in those." Relia ignored him, scanning the facility. The guards were positioned in tight formations, their weapons primed for any threat. They would need a distraction. Daniel followed her gaze. "You're thinking of starting a fight, aren't you?" She smirked. "You started one first." Daniel gave her a lopsided grin. "All right. Let's cause some chaos." The infiltration begins. Moving like shadows, they slipped down the side of the facility, avoiding the motion sensors and security drones that hovered lazily in the air. Daniel pressed a small device to the outer wall and flicked a switch. A few seconds later, boom! An explosion rocked the far side of the facility. Alarms blared. Lights flashed red. The soldiers rushed toward the disturbance, and Relia and Daniel ran in the opposite direction. They slipped into a side passage, racing through the corridors. Relia's mind worked quickly, counting the turns, memorizing the security rotations. The ventilation shaft loomed ahead. Unlocked. Daniel eyed it. "You first, princess." She rolled her eyes but climbed in. The metal was freezing against her skin, and the cramped space forced her to move carefully. Daniel followed, muttering under his breath, "I swear, if there are alien bugs in here." They crawled through the twisting vents, the sound of distant shouts and running boots echoing through the facility. Then, Relia spotted it, a grate leading into the reactor chamber. She carefully kicked it open, landing silently on the catwalk below. Daniel dropped beside her. "So where's this power core?" Relia scanned the chamber. The room was massive, lined with massive power conduits that pulsed with energy. And at the center, suspended in a containment field, was the power core, a shimmering orb of concentrated energy, humming with untapped power. Daniel let out a low whistle. "Well, that's pretty." Relia was already moving. "It's locked in a security field. I need time to override it." Daniel nodded. "I'll cover you." The enemy arrives. She hacked into the controls, fingers moving fast over the alien console. Then, the door slammed open. A squad of elite guards stormed in, weapons raised. And at the front was her father. Commander Verne stepped forward, his expression cold, unreadable. "I warned you, Relia." She didn't stop working. "And I warned you. I'm not weak anymore." Verne exhaled sharply. "This human has poisoned your mind." Daniel scoffed. "Buddy, I've barely said anything." Verne drew his sword, a deadly curved blade, humming with lethal energy. "Enough," he said. "This ends now." The final battle. The guards opened fire. Daniel dove behind a console, returning shots with brutal efficiency. His rifle hummed, dropping enemies one by one. Relia gritted her teeth. The security override was at 60%. Not fast enough. Verne charged. Relia barely dodged as his blade slashed through the air, cutting deep into the control panel beside her. Sparks flew. "You were my greatest failure," Verne said, swinging again. Relia blocked with her knife, the impact jarring her arm. "No, father. You were mine." She twisted, aiming a kick to his ribs. He barely flinched. Daniel fired a shot, but Verne dodged at the last second, the blast scorching the floor instead. The guards kept coming. Daniel was running out of ammo. The security override hit 90%. Verne lunged. And this time, Relia didn't dodge. Instead, she stepped inside his guard, catching his wrist before he could swing. She twisted, a move he had taught her. For the first time, his expression flickered with surprise. She grabbed his own blade and drove it into his side. Verne staggered back, eyes wide. Relia's breathing was ragged. She had won, but he didn't fall. He simply smiled. "You finally understand," he murmured. "Good." The security override hit 100%. The containment field dropped. The power core was free. Daniel grabbed it, stuffing it into his pack. Time to go. Relia hesitated. Her father was dying. Did she leave him? Or? Vern gave her a knowing look, a silent message. Survive. She clenched her fists, then turned away. She and Daniel raced toward the exit. Behind them, alarms blared louder, and the facility began to collapse. The escape. They sprinted through the tunnels, dodging falling debris, blaster fire whizzing past them. Daniel gritted his teeth. Tell me we've got a way out. Relia's mind raced. The ship. The crashed human ship. If we can get back to the wreck. Boom. An explosion knocked them off their feet. The tunnel behind them caved in. They were trapped. Relia's chest heaved. We're not gonna make it. Daniel glanced at the power core in his hands, then back at her. And suddenly, he grinned. Actually, he said, I think we might. She frowned. What? He pointed upward. A massive hangar bay loomed above them. And inside was a fully intact alien fighter ship. Daniel slung his rifle over his shoulder. I don't know how to fly that. But you do, don't you? Relia stared. Then, slowly, a grin spread across her face. Get in, she said. Daniel whooped. Now that's what I'm talking about. They raced toward the fighter, guards closing in behind them. The engines roared to life. The ship lifted off. And just as the facility exploded beneath them, they escaped. Cliffhanger ending. The fighter shot into the sky, breaking free of the planet's gravity. Relia sat back in the pilot's seat, breathless. Daniel glanced at her. So, where to now? She looked out at the endless stars. For the first time in her life, she was free. A new home among the stars. The alien fighter roared through the atmosphere, its engines blazing as it shot into the vast emptiness of space. Relia gripped the controls tightly, her heart pounding. The stars stretched out before her, open, endless, free. She had spent her entire life on that cursed planet, bound by the rigid laws of her people, never truly belonging. Now, for the first time, she was leaving it behind. Beside her, Daniel Carter let out a low whistle. Well, that was fun. He leaned back in the co-pilot's chair, the power core they had stolen secured in a compartment behind them. Relia exhaled sharply. You have an interesting definition of fun, human. He grinned. We survived, didn't we? She didn't respond. She was still processing everything. Her father, Commander Vern. She had left him behind. He had accepted it. He had wanted her to leave. Her clan would brand her a traitor now. She could never return. But did she even want to? Daniel tapped the side of the console. All right, Captain. What's next? She frowned. Captain. He shrugged. Well, you're the one flying the ship. That makes you the captain, doesn't it? Relia blinked at him. A captain. She had never been in control of her own life before. She had always been a soldier, a warrior following orders. Now, she had a choice. Escape isn't freedom. She turned her focus back to the navigation system. The alien fighter was fast, but it wasn't built for deep space travel. It had limited fuel, and without proper refueling, they wouldn't get far. Daniel noticed her hesitation. Problem. Even if we made it off-planet, we're not safe yet, she admitted. My people, they don't just let things go. They'll hunt us. Daniel sighed. Yeah, I figured. He rolled his shoulder, wincing slightly from his injury. So what do we do? She thought for a moment. We need to get to a human colony. Somewhere safe. Somewhere your people can help us. Daniel nodded. Lucky for us, I know a guy. Relia narrowed her eyes. That doesn't sound reassuring. Daniel smirked. Don't worry. He owes me a favor. Or 3. She sighed. Fine. Where is he? Daniel leaned over the console, typing in a set of coordinates. A distant star system blinked on the screen. Ever heard of Haven Station? Relia stiffened. She had heard of it. A human-run outpost, far from the central galactic territories. A place for smugglers, exiles, and those running from something. It was dangerous, lawless, but it was better than staying here. Set course for Haven, she said. A past that won't stay buried. As Relia engaged the ship's autopilot, she leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. The exhaustion hit her like a tidal wave. Daniel glanced at her. "You okay?" She didn't answer right away. Everything she had ever known was gone. She had betrayed her own kind. She had chosen to fight alongside a human rather than return to her people. Had she made the right choice? Finally, she exhaled. "I will be." Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. He didn't push. She was grateful for that. For a while, they sat in silence, watching the stars pass. Then, the ship's proximity alarm blared. Relia snapped to attention. What was that? Daniel checked the scanners. "Looks like we got company." She turned to the screen, and her stomach dropped. A massive warship was appearing on the edge of their sensors. Her people had found them. The final chase. The alien warship was massive, its shadow stretching across the emptiness of space. Relia's heart pounded. "They must have tracked us from the facility," she muttered. Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle. "Can we outrun them?" Relia's hands flew over the controls. "Not in this ship. We weren't built for long-range pursuit." A red light flashed on the console. Incoming transmission. She hesitated. Daniel looked at her. "Don't answer it." She didn't, but she already knew who it was. The warship was hailing her. Her father. She swallowed hard. He was still alive, and he was still coming after her. Daniel was already strapping himself into his seat. "Looks like we're doing this the hard way." Relia nodded. "I wouldn't have it any other way." She pushed the engines to their limit. The ship lurched forward, dodging as the warship opened fire. Energy blasts exploded around them. "We won't last long," Daniel yelled. Relia's mind raced. There had to be a way to lose them. And then she saw it. Ahead, a nebula. A massive storm of gas and debris. She smirked. "Hold on, human." And then she dived straight into it. Through fire and shadow. The fighter shook violently as they entered the nebula. The ship's systems flickered, alarms blaring warnings of unstable conditions. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" "No," she admitted, "but it's our only chance." The warship hesitated at the nebula's edge. It was too big to follow without risking serious damage. But Relia's ship was small, agile. She weaved through the dense clouds, pushing the engines to their breaking point. The scanners flickered, unable to get a solid reading. And then, silence. The warship was gone. Relia let out a breath. They had made it. Daniel exhaled. "Well, that was terrifying." She smirked. "You get used to it." His laugh was soft, almost disbelieving. "I don't think I'd want to." She set course again. The stars stretched before them, endless and free. A new beginning. Relia stared out at the vast expanse of space. She had left everything behind. Her people, her past, her father. She had chosen a different path, a dangerous one. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. Daniel glanced at her. "So what now, Captain?" She smiled. "Now," she said, leaning back in her seat, "now we see what the universe has to offer." And with that, they disappeared into the stars.